Mr. Philip Campbell here with my series of honors course lectures on American history, and we're going to wrap up the lecture series today talking again about culture, this time television in the 1990s and how things evolved really drastically on television programming throughout the decade of the 1990s. If you go back in American history, the period from about 1929, which is when radio first became a universal medium of communication, up until about 1989, which was when cable TV really came into its own. From that period of 1929 to 1989, the entire country, across the population, young, old, rich, poor, every racial demographic, were essentially drinking from the same trough of entertainment culture. This is due to the dominance of the three major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC. For that entire period of time, pretty much all Americans were getting their media entertainment on television through these three networks. So there was a great uniformity of popular entertainment culture that unified the country in a certain sense. This era really essentially came to an end in the 1990s with the proliferation of cable programming, which offered so many more channels. I mean, I remember when I was a kid in the 80s, we had three channels, CBS, ABC, and NBC, three major channels, and then you had a couple smaller channels like PBS, the public network. Yeah, and that was it. You had PBS and then three major channels. That was it. And then in the 90s, you started to have the proliferation of cable channels that catered to niche audiences. You had channels popping up that were devoted just to sports, channels just for news, channels just for cooking or just for cartoons, or all these different niches. And with the creation of each new cable news channel, the audience continually got divided up, so each channel was vying for a smaller and smaller audience. And the result is that through the 90s, we got the what really was the loss of a shared cultural experience through television as the population fragmented into smaller niche audiences. So that's really something that changed through the 90s. People wonder why Americans are more divided now. Yes, there's political differences that are more polarized. Yes, social media has contributed to it, but we should also look at the fragmentation of television culture in the 90s. One other thing that changed in the 90s was 90s TV began really pushing the limits of what could be aired. And it's really amazing to think of how this has changed over the years. You go back to the 1950s and the show I Love Lucy. Lucille Ball was pregnant, and they were not allowed to say the word pregnant on the show. They had to say she was with child or she was expecting or whatever, because pregnant was deemed to be too inappropriate to say on TV. Of course, things lightened up since the 50s, but even into the 80s, 1980s television programming tried to be very wholesome. 1980s television programming was very family-oriented. The sitcoms featured wholesome mother and father figures, positive lessons. They tried to be very moral and family-oriented, kind of in keeping with the spirit of the 80s as a resurgent American dream epoch. The 80s were really trying to be a throwback to the 50s. But moving into the late 80s and the 90s, there really was a strong pushback against that moral ethos you had on television. If I just go through some of the changes that happened on television in the late 80s and early 90s. Of course, in 1988, we have the introduction of The Simpsons, which is going to be the most popular television program in popular cartoon program in history, and the first primetime cartoon television series since the Flintstones. The Simpsons really turned that 80s family dynamic on its head. Instead of a wise, knowledgeable father figure, of course, the character of Homer Simpson is a dumb, imbecilic father figure. And this really set a trend. Other shows in the 90s would try to capitalize on this idea of the dumb comic relief father figure like Home Improvement, which debuted in 1991, where the shtick of Home Improvement was that Tim Allen, the father figure, was always breaking everything and messing up. Not that these were bad programs, but I'm pointing out that they introduced a different concept into the program, which was of the stupid, imbecilic, bumbling, sometimes selfish father. Fast forward to 1992, you had a sitcom called Murphy Brown, which was about a fictional newsroom, and this caused controversy because the main character, Murphy Brown, got pregnant in the show and voluntarily chose to remain as a single mother. Now, you'd had single parents on television before in the 80s, but it was often due to some tragedy, like the spouse died or something like that. What happened in Murphy Brown in 1992 was she got pregnant and then voluntarily decided to stay a single mother. And this was somewhat controversial. There was a famous little controversy where Vice President Dan Quayle cited the episode of Murphy Brown as a mockery to family values. And indeed, conservative religious viewers were upset that the network would portray a woman intentionally deciding to stay an unwed mother. When it comes to violence and nudity and profanity, the limits here were really pushed by a show called NYPD Blue, which debuted in 1993 and would go on until I think the early 2000s. But NYPD Blue was a cop drama set in New York City, and it was known for pushing the boundaries of what could be done on network television with nudity, with violence. It had a famous scene where it showed buttocks on male buttocks on TV for the first time on network television. It was very, very controversial. And so the limits were continually pushed. The following year, 1994, the popular blue-class sitcom Roseanne featured what I think was television's first lesbian kiss. And there was a huge outrage about this. I remember Kraft threatened to pull its advertising, and the network was worried about featuring a lesbian kiss, but then they thought that the controversy would be good for ratings, so they intentionally tried to promote this as the lesbian kiss episode, and it was one of the most famous episodes of Roseanne. Meanwhile, you had Fox Network, which had come to prominence with The Simpsons. Its other major sitcom, Married with Children, which aired from 1987 to 1997, again recycling the trope of the stupid, selfish father figure in Al Bundy, who not only was stupid like Homer Simpson, but also looked at pornography, and this was made light of, and it was just part of his character. Pornography and all these different unwholesome behaviors and whatnot. Then mentioned the lesbian kiss on Roseanne. In 1997, the show Ellen, featuring Ellen DeGeneres. Ellen became the first character on a network show to come out as a homosexual character, and this was very controversial as well. But yeah, in 1997 on the Ellen show, her character came out as homosexual. Of course, Ellen DeGeneres herself is homosexual in real life, which was not a surprise to anyone. So all these different moral issues were being pushed on television throughout the 90s. You also had the emergence of adult cartoons with risque content, such as Beavis and Butthead, which came on the air in 1993 and 1997, and also South Park, which is still on the air today, but came out in 1997. These were cartoons, but they were oriented towards adults and dealt with very explicit topics and contained extreme crudity. Couple this with the trend in the early 1990s of the popularity of gangsta rap, which was a new thing in the 90s. This was a kind of rap music which glorified urban violence and drug use and things like that. And there was a belief that these violent songs and music videos led to an increase in violent crime. So all these things that were pushing the boundaries of violence and sexuality and moral questions and all these things led to essentially a constant pushback or refrain from parents and family groups throughout groups throughout the 1990s that television was not safe for children anymore, and I don't think we can debate that today. Probably, if you're a Catholic, one of the dumbest things you can do is just give your kid a remote and let them watch whatever they want on TV. The television programming today is definitely not safe for children, but it wasn't like that in the 1980s. In the 1980s, by and large, sitcom programming was, families were portrayed in a wholesome way, with acceptable themes. Risque subjects were generally avoided. And there was also a lot of reruns, excuse me, of older programs. When I was a kid in the 80s, you could still see Leave It to Beaver or The Little Rascals on television. So all this has changed in the 90s, though. The 90s is the decade where television transfigures itself from something that's more or less family friendly to something that is like, oh my goodness, don't let your kids watch it without supervision. It did lead to a few innovations. There was a television rating system that was instituted in 1996 where shows were rated like movies. It's a lot more complicated than the movie rating system, but this rating system still exists today. Also, the development of something called the V-chip, which was a device that's supposed to be implanted in television that allows a parent to block or scramble certain kinds of programming. And Bill Clinton's Telecommunications Act of 1996 actually mandated that all new televisions had to be produced with the V-chip. So, at any rate, it did lead to those innovations, but of course, the proliferation of risque, morally questionable content would just continue to the point where it is today, where there's almost nothing that they won't put on television. So at any rate, if you're wondering when television really transitioned from being more wholesome and family friendly into the moral cesspool it is today, it was during the 1990s that all that happened, that everything kind of came unhinged.